Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ben McNally. I'm a client lead at Gallium Solutions, where I work with dual-use technology companies that are pursuing government contracts. I'm also a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and a former fellow at the Clements Center for National Security. Eric Schmidt, the first chairman of the Defense Innovation Board and former CEO of Alphabet, has famously said that the Department of Defense does not have an innovation problem, but an innovation adoption problem. This administration's national defense strategy states that we live in a decisive decade, and that getting the technology we need more quickly is a key step to building enduring advantages for our force. Certain leaders in the Department of Defense have recognized that much of the technology we need in this decisive decade is coming from new companies, and that the government needs to be a better adopter of this innovation coming out of these companies. Thanks to the work being done at organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit and AFWorks, it's never been easier for a new company to prototype solutions to priority military mission problems. But there's still a significant obstacle: transitioning companies from contracts that use funding from research and development budgets to contracts that use funding from procurement budgets, which at present is the only way the department will be able to field new, critical capabilities at scale. Today, I'm honored to be joined by 4 individuals who have all worked this problem inside government and are now leading change in industry. Cameron Holt is a retired Major General in the United States Air Force, where he finished his career as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. In this position, he was responsible for all aspects of contracting related to the acquisition of weapon systems, logistics, and operational support for the Air Force. He held numerous assignments throughout his 32-year career, including serving as commander of the Air Force Installation Contracting Agency, Director of Contracting for the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, and commander of the 14th Contracting Squadron. Pete Modigliani is a vice president at Beacon Global Strategies. Prior to joining Beacons, Pete spent 26 years as a defense acquisition professional working at MITRE, where he led initiatives including the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, Rapid, and Software Acquisition Pathways. Prior to MITRE, Pete was an Air Force program manager and assistant vice president with Allian Science and Technology. He is part of 3 commissions on defense innovation and acquisition reforms and manages a defense acquisition substack. David Rothzeid is currently an investor at Shield Capital, a San Francisco-based firm which closed its first fund at $186 million this past September. Shield Capital invests in early-stage companies building solutions in cybersecurity, autonomy, space, artificial intelligence, and other technologies for commercial and national security use cases and customers. Prior to his current role at Shield, he spent 13 years on active duty in the Air Force as an acquisitions officer, where he served in a myriad of roles to include assignments at the Pentagon, Silicon Valley with the Defense Innovation Unit, Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts, Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, and a deployment with the Special Operations Command. He's still a reservist at the Pentagon and lives here locally in DC with his wife Lauren and dog Bentley. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Zachary Mears. Zach is Senior Vice President of Strategy at Anduril Industries. Prior to Anduril, he was a senior advisor at Covington and Burling, where he worked with companies in the aerospace, defense, and national security sectors. During his time in government, he served as Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council, Chief of Staff to Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, and Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
I'd like to first start by talking about the threat environment, which is really the ultimate reason why we're here talking about why we need to solve this problem of transition and this problem of innovation adoption. Zach, you served on the National Security Council during Russia's invasion of Crimea, which heavily influenced Robert Work's thinking when he was championing the third offset strategy. It's now been almost 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What has this conflict taught us about the future of warfare and the importance of making it easier to spend money today to get capabilities in the hands of our service members tomorrow?
Well, thanks, Ben, first for shepherding our conversation over the next hour or so. Thanks for all the audience members that are tuning in to both hear our remarks and hopefully be inspired to take some actions that come out of the dialogue today. So very much hope this is a back and forth across all of us. Ben, as you laid out, part of the discussion that we had in advance of the panel was, how the department continues to organize itself today against the capabilities needed for little R requirements that both U.S. forces as well as our allied and partner forces are facing forward. And this was an animating problem for Bob and Ash back in 2012, moving through their tenure in early 2017, and certainly underpinned as we thought about third offset and the differentiated capabilities that could move at a speed to respond to the threats that were challenging both the ability of U.S. and allied forces to understand their disposition on the battlefield, to understand the disposition of the adversary, and to generate timely effects, be those passive or active, against adversary forces. And what was quite plain then, and I think has been made plain over the last 2 years in our experience in Ukraine, is that we still lack the mechanisms to deliver forward at relevant speed responsive capability to that threat. There are existing authorities that exist within the department to enable us to do so, but our practice so far has not yet adopted. If you look at the broad balance of capability that has moved through aid packages over the last 18 months, it is largely traditional systems. If you look at what the Ukrainians are identifying and advising us back through SAGU are important and relevant, their adoptions on the battlefield. And it is that test environment that is very difficult for us to replicate today. The cyber security attacks, electronic warfare attacks across that spectrum are incredibly difficult to mimic and ensure the resilience of capability. So how do we build that into the way we think about T&E, demonstration, experimentation, to fielding? Not just building, as others in industry, especially amongst the primes and middle tiers have discussed, building some level of anti-fragility into their current capability. How do we build resilience into the new commercially developed technology that we have an opportunity to start near zero building forward today? And so part of the underpinning of how Bob, Ash, and the rest of the team that built up the Advanced Capability Deterrent Panel that was basically the underbelly of animating third offset was, how do we tap into those other areas of technology and commercial development that are largely happening outside of and being seeded by capital that lives outside the department's RDT&E budget, and bring that capability in at relevant speed and scale to address these threats that are not moving at a generational pace like we plan for our capital assets. They are moving at a time and a speed that requires the responsiveness of a commercial product and a commercial business model.
General Holt, when you first became Deputy Assistant Secretary for Contracting, you organized a threat briefing for the entire Air Force contracting workforce that explained the threat from China in great detail. When looking at the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA, and their strategy of civil-military fusion vis-a-vis our military and industrial congressional complex, what concerns you?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question, Ben, and again, thank you for having this important discussion. When I did that, what I wanted to achieve is, frankly, I still don't see it. There's a lot of talk in the press about China. There's a lot of good speeches about it. I frankly don't think I still don't believe we're on a wartime footing. And I think that our acquisition community, our contracting community, our financing and resourcing process has to get on a wartime footing. We're behind in many important ways. We're ahead in a lot of ways. And so, I probably should say that China should think twice about challenging us militarily. But having said that, they're moving faster than we're moving. When I sit in the Pentagon and I hear a lot about the Taiwan Straits or about the military instrument of national power, I actually think that our adversaries are sophisticated enough to attack our supply chains, to corner the market on key materials, to deter other nations economically, to deter business leaders and government leaders economically, and through information power. Having said all that, I still believe that military overmatch, if we can achieve strategic military overmatch in capability, that will have a deterring effect against war. And so, as the new head of contracting, I didn't want my first conversations with my community to be about FAR 15402. I wanted them to see somebody that has sat in the same cubicles that they've sat in, have felt the same frustrations that they have felt, have endured the withering criticisms of a bureaucratic contracting enterprise that they did not invent themselves. And I wanted them to see somebody like them stand up and talk for an hour in detail about the actual operational threat and where the U.S. and China and Russia are against each other today and where we will be after the planned 6-year Future Years Defense Plan. And of course, I can't get into the details of that discussion here, but I wanted them to understand their role in disruptively changing it. And I wanted to ask them, not tell them, I wanted to ask them to follow me by using their detailed knowledge of the FAR and the acquisition and the contracting rules that are so far antiquated. And instead of using that to keep everybody out of jail or just to be compliance oriented, to turn their attention towards the mission and hacking that old system. So that we can start to harness the private sector capitalist motivation and align those incentives with national defense priorities. And if we can inspire a workforce and frankly protect them against the recrimination culture in doing that and remove a lot of the barriers and align industry and government, I think we could actually move so much faster than any of our adversaries can.
David, Zach mentioned earlier having a good structure for major capital assets, but there being the sort of new dimension of warfare that companies that are coming up, that are being funded by venture capital firms like yours are working with. Dr. Mears' colleague at Anduril, Chris Bros, wrote a white paper entitled The Moneyball Military, where he advocates for an alternative defense process with the reverse polarity of the PPBE system that would have DIU become more of a program office that's empowered to bypass the traditional suppliers of military power in the PPBE system and deliver commercially derived but appropriately militarized solutions directly to operational forces, with the expectation that those systems will be consumed and quickly bought anew. Do you think that this is an appropriate role for DIU, and if so, what kind of changes would need to be made there to execute this strategy?
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, for having me. Thank you to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here with you. I had an opportunity to reread Christian's white paper on Moneyball Military, and you know he's prolific. I also had the opportunity to read his seminal book, The Kill Chain, which I think really did jumpstart a lot of the discussions that we're having today, helping us understand and use the right lexicon to even be able to transverse these different ideals and norms of what the military-industrial complex does on a day-to-day basis, and then how the commercial ecosystem operates. And having been at Defense Innovation Unit and then in the bowels of the Pentagon, I sort of get to see, I've seen that side play out as well. You know, if I were to be petty about Christian's title, the Moneyball, you know, I would say the Oakland A's, they never actually won the World Series. And barring a miracle, they will no longer be playing in Oakland. So I'm not exactly sure if that's necessarily the strategy, but the intent of what he is getting after, I think, is spot on. And that's saying that the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, the PPB&E, which is, you know, the 4-letter word that everybody sort of rankles at around here for why we can't move and modernize faster, certainly has a part to play. And what Christian is advocating for is that we start to move away from that centralized sort of Soviet-style central planning mode, right? That preferences huge R&D for long-tail sustainment where you're making 9 to 11% of profit on a cost-plus contract, and instead start to maneuver more of that funding to procurement, relying on the third-party capital markets to help spin up the R&D based on, you know, signaling or just tech advancement that can then be used in consumable ways that will allow us to kind of refresh the defense industry base. And, you know, what role Defense Innovation Unit has to play, I think they've proven that they can take things and prototype them from the commercial sector, apply it to the military context, perturbate the system, right, if need be, to make it more relevant to the warfighter. And then, of course, they've kind of, through the teachings of the General Holts of the world and the Lorna Tedders and others, crafted a contracting mechanism that allows you to move quickly from prototype to production. So all that being on the table, if you want to scale Defense Innovation Unit, and I think they still need to maintain their strong relationships with the services and the co-coms, because that's who originates the needs. I think in a zero-sum bureaucracy, unless we're going to continue to fall prey to the Parkinson's law of the bureaucracy just forever grows, we need to start actually making cuts, right? So for every DIU person we add, should we be cutting from the research labs that are predominantly doing R&D that maybe isn't moving at the speed of relevance to meet the needs of the warfighter? I don't see that ever quite being talked about, and I think if we're going to have an honest conversation around putting more resources behind the AFWorks, the DIUs, the Chief Digital Artificial Intelligence Office, then it's got to come out of hide from somewhere else, because we can't just continue to grow and grow and grow, because more people just adds more time, time adds friction, and friction puts us further behind the 8 ball. So I think, love what Christian's putting out there from a Moneyball military affect. I think we also need to recognize what are the secondary and tertiary steps that have to be addressed in order to achieve it.
Sure. Zach, any comment on that?
Yes, I mean, it won't surprise you to hear, I had many conversations with Chris as he drafted the article, as did many of us within the company. I think rather than debate, like, is DIU the appropriate program office, as I think Cameron would attest, if there's one thing that will turn the service's nose up quite quickly, it's an OSD component as the executive agent for a program. And outside of MDA, we largely see OSD as a component that is seeking to support the capability providers within the department, which are our services. At the same time, we do need to reconcile what I think the piece does well, which is diagnose the fact that our current system, relative to what we are currently observing in Russia and Ukraine, and as we think about the benefits of affordable mass across domains using commercially derived solutions, cheaper ways of fabricating our core hulls for underwater vehicles, more available commercial sensors, core basic compute that can power not just one but many smaller devices. As you think about the decision advantage that you can generate from sensing across that network set of capabilities, either within a domain or across, and as you think about those capabilities on some spectrum of attritable to expendable, both relative to each other and then relative to the band asset that would otherwise be performing that mission, how do we reconcile having diagnosed this problem and align incentives that actually give us the mechanisms to field these capabilities at scale? One could argue that Replicator has the intent to start to address some of those challenges.
Sure.
I think the proof will be in the pudding in terms of the first tranche of capability that is delivered. And then ultimately, I think many of us would probably agree with, how you think about the command and control of those capabilities. It's one thing to demonstrate mass. It's another thing to use that mass effectively to generate decision challenges for your adversary. So how you think about the command and control and how we organize around these capabilities also deserves, to David's point, the secondary and tertiary evaluation of how we actually man, train, equip, and organize around these capabilities that don't have the sustainment tail, that require a different manufacturing sustainment approach. So how companies in the industrial base think about inventory carry, how we think about IRAD spend against those types of things, and the durability of that IRAD over time, requires a different incentive structure. And if there's one thing that I think remains true, is that the department broadly doesn't lack for the authorities to do these things. And as the deputy herself said, over 18 months ago, in one of her first trips out to Silicon Valley, it's, we don't lack for the authorities or the organizational structures to do these things. We lack incentive alignment. Mm-hmm. So how you think about incentive alignment from privately capitalized businesses like ourselves, those that David and the team at SHIELD are funding, I think requires us to actually shine a light on that problem and have a deliberate conversation about how we actually move some of these things into the field at some reasonable scale. And I think that's one of the areas that I think the piece from Chris, whether you want to quibble with the title or quibble with whether DIU should ultimately be that program office, the underlying diagnosis, I think, would get a lot of head nods and shared recognition across the acquisition community as being true. Now, what can we do to start aligning that with the types of threats that we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia, and those that we believe that we would confront in the Indo-Pacific, especially on the surface, in the air, and in space?
Absolutely. General Holt, on the subject of folks not lacking authorities. In 2021, during a fireside chat with Joe Lonsdale at Fed Supernova in Austin, you said that we still have the acquisition and resourcing system of the Cold War, and that's not going to win in this next challenge. But the vehicles that have been used to put companies like Anduril, Hawkeye 360, other new innovative firms doing great things on contracts have been around for decades. Things like SBIR, OTs, others. Is the problem the system or the resources that it makes available, or is it that simply too many contracting and acquisition professionals aren't incentivized to use all the resources at their disposal to find a way to get to yes?
Well, I hate to tell you this, but it's actually both. There is, to Zach's point, there is a ton of things that we can do that I would call inside the box innovation. And the organizations like DIU and others have blazed paths that show that that's possible. As I was a young lieutenant colonel on the Joint Staff years ago, when General Petraeus needed a lot more ISR in theater, in just 2 years, we pushed $9.2 billion worth of non-traditional ISR into that theater. We didn't violate any rules for doing it. We did need congressional support to move money around with great alacrity rather than having to get Mother May I's through that system. So that speaks to the PPBE process. But when there is alignment of incentives and when we are on a wartime footing, everybody's process objections seem to fade away because of the objective at hand. Right before I left the Pentagon, I led a task force to execute the Air Force's responsibilities in the pandemic relief effort. And frankly, we were asked to shore up the defense industrial base that had been threatened immediately and also reshore all the medical manufacturing that was critical to the response effort. We spent $5 billion in a few months building whole factories at a time. We did that in a compliant way. We did that in addition to the regular job that we have. So yes, there's a lot to be said about protecting the workforce from a recrimination culture, and instead of honoring the process, honor the outcome. And if attempts fail because they were just a bad idea or they didn't work out, instead of reacting to them in a way that shuts down programs or ends careers, we have to celebrate those things. Now, ethical problems I don't support. Now, those are inside the box innovations. I led a change effort I called mission-focused business leadership to turn our attention away from what I thought was compliance-focused business advice, a more passive role, a more compliance-oriented role, and instead just hack the system and find the best ways to get the mission done. Having said that, you probably know I sat on the Section 809 panel as well as a participant with Pete and others. And so I don't think that the FAR or some of our structures are necessarily bad documents. They certainly never stopped me from doing anything that I wanted to do. But the assumption that all of those rules have been based on since the 1960s in the PPBE process that Robert McNamara gave to us, and we're still using that to fight the CCP? Are you kidding me? The assumptions that underline that rule set have changed, and there's no acknowledgement, really, that that's happened. And as a result of that, you get a lot of inertia from Congress and the way they oversee, to industry and the way that they get money in the bills to be spent by the Department of Defense, and to several jobs in the Department of Defense and org structures in the Department of Defense that protect themselves by making sure that you're in the right lanes, you're following the right process, not that you get the right outcomes. So there is a lot of structural outside the box type of systemic change that's necessary. We talked about PPBE. That's definitely in sore need of change, and frankly, it's not DOD down, it's got to be Congress down. Congress has a right to oversee, and that's their constitutional responsibility. We should never do away with that. In fact, I think the transparency level needs to come way up throughout the POM build and all the way through execution. It should be transparent to all, apart from classified lines. But at the same time, we've got to stop trying to centrally manage everything. We're not going to beat China by being China. And so we've got to start allowing real authority to get results in these PEO portfolios where PEOs can actually move money in execution. And instead of protecting an established program of record that it took everybody 8 years to go through the requirements process and the budgeting process and the acquisition process to get to, we're buying old technology to begin with, and the industry is incentivized to lose money up front and then make sure that weapon system's around for decades so that they can get their money back. That's going to lose with our adversaries in the world today. So there is a lot of change that's necessary. I would tell you the commercial tech marketplace has automatically changed their approach from a very much so IP vendor lock type of an approach to a speed to market approach for sustained profitability. And I think that's a lot of what Chris is talking about.
Yes.
Is why do we think that we have to develop everything with a very, very slow and linear process? Why don't we align the incentives and create the right incentives to simply buy it and bring it to market? But we've got to remove the barriers to entry, and the level of competition needs to increase dramatically. And so there's a number of ideas that we don't have time to get into on how you do that. So the answer to your question is there's a lot we can do without asking anybody's permission, but there is structural change and systemic change that's necessary, and it needs to be done really, really rapidly. We are wasting time just talking about it.
So Pete, obviously on this panel, as well as very often in these kinds of discussions, we hear people talk about the vagaries of the PPPE process. We also hear people talk about the need for acquisition reform, which is a whole other conversation. But one thing that we don't often hear people talk about is the need for the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System to be modernized for an era where lower cost, hardware-defined, software-enabled systems are redefining warfare. What should or would a 21st century JCIDS process look like?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, and that's a critically important question. You know, it's often overlooked the DoD's requirement system as the third major enterprise process that is in dire need of modernization for the current environment. Because if the requirements aren't set up properly, you're just setting up the program to fail. We have the JCIDS process, which has been around for a while, managed by a joint staff. It is a massively bureaucratic, painfully slow, rigid process that needs to change. You look at the policy, and the manual itself is 500 pages just to navigate the process. But we'll spend years up front documenting, defining requirements for a new system that replaces a 30-year-old legacy system. We'll define it, lock it down, and then say, all right, that's your requirements for the next X number of years of development, then production, with the hopes that we'll keep it operational for the next 30 to 50 years. Guaranteed to get that wrong. So we need a modern approach. And we talked about this with the Section 809 panel as we were fixing acquisition. We clearly understood you needed to modernize requirements. We've had reports that were included in NDAA legislation. And the recent Atlantic Council Commission, which we just finished up, had a key recommendation on modernizing DoD requirements, and it's now in the current FY24 NDAA. So for that modern approach, it's a much more rapid and dynamic approach to capturing requirements that harnesses what leading technologies out there, particularly in industry, to move from hey, I'll have a rapid iterative approach. We'll do an MVP. We'll have a prototype. We'll experiment with some commercial technologies. If it works, great. Let's scale it. If it doesn't, let's pivot to a new environment. But break from that mindset of I'm going to define a program system-centric requirements document and navigate that through the process and focus more on what are the broader threats, what are the combatant command's priorities, where are the capability gaps that they see, and put it in that broader, whether it's mission threads, broader capability areas, and have that integrated suite of capabilities to deliver that. Highlight what's the priority to the operational commanders, and let the community come and build capabilities to meet those needs. How do we move the needle on whatever the operational performance priorities that they value? We need better alignment between the requirements and acquisition pathways. We need better alignment across the various organizations. what Joint Staff is doing versus the services versus combatant commands versus OSD and the broader community. There's so many disconnects and competing interests. So it still goes back to how do we get better capabilities faster to the warfighter? How do we harness what's commercially available? So again, it's that operational pull versus the tech push. If industry has some great tech, clear military capability, how do we validate that and get that out to the field? But it all, fills into that broader portfolio approach. So it's the greater alignment, greater speed and agility in the system.
So, Pete, it's really interesting that you mentioned, building capabilities in the absence of requirements. David, during your time at DIU, you worked at an organization whose charter was to accelerate commercial technology for national security. Practically none of those commercial technologies had requirements, but quite a few of them ended up providing a really important capability to solve a military mission problem. In 2020 on the DIUX podcast, you advocated for being able to do a cash infusion for a promising technology that has a DoD customer, but requires a bridge to wait out the 2-year-long PBBE cycle. And you've also talked about the need for DoD to dedicate more money to funding scale-ups that have the promise to deliver critical capabilities to service members, but again, because it's not a requirement, sort of gets stuck in the valley of death. Do the hedge portfolio that HACD proposed for DIU, new programs from the Office of Strategic Capital, or OSD's AppBit program get after that problem, or is something else needed?
Yeah, thank you. And just real quick before I answer that, Pete, 500 pages for the JSIDs. General Holt, what's the FAR?
It's between the FAR and DFARs, it's over 4,500 pages.
Yeah.
And the financial management reg is
7,000.
7,000.
7,000. So, come on, Pete. Chump change. Okay, so let's talk about some solutions. So on that podcast, I was 2020, so well done, Ben, on finding me. I was talking about this idea that I've now sort of refined and called it the preemptive year of execution. So what happens when you have a prototype project that's just crushing it and the COCOM says, I need that now? What if you had a kind of a revolving door fund where you could, instead of paying for non-priorities with your unfunded requirements end of year slush fund, which is what happens today, and I would guess 10 to 15% of procurement, R&D, O&M funding goes towards that valley of nowhere, right? Which pays for TVs and all kinds of things that aren't truly critical because we're making decisions at the last second. You could actually forward fund promising technology that is making its way into the POM for the future year, and then you back pay it the next year. So this requires a flexible funding format that I don't think the appropriators are going to go for yet, but I just don't think we've advised them in a compelling enough way to really send it home. So this is one idea, and I got to give credit. It was on a conversation with Moshe Schwartz, who at the time was at the Congressional Research Service. Now he's with Etherton and Associates. He's a brilliant guy.
Yes.
And we talked about that years ago. On the other idea, scale-ups. So, General Holt, 20% of all contracts, primes must go to small businesses, 30% of subcontracts must go to small businesses. This is a federal agency-wide mandate, so it's not just the DoD. And I fear that a lot of what we're getting for that 20% and 30%, which is all good intentions, right, coming out of the small business acts of yesteryear, is to kind of seed small entrepreneurs to be able to build new companies. But they get stuck in the small business game where they don't necessarily want to grow to a certain level because then maybe they won't be relevant to be able to compete. And so what you get is a lot of services out of those types of companies, and probably services that are fairly replaceable between each other. Instead, with scale-ups, what if we created a policy that mandated a certain type of structure, maybe the Andurils of the world and other venture-backed startups that are building product that want to grow. They don't want to stay small. They want to be able to compete, and they're going to sell into the defense tech market. They're going to sell into healthcare. They're going to sell into fintech, right? And there's probably going to be a through line that makes that technology relevant regardless of the industry. And we had a subset of mandating that certain amount of prime contracts, and I think even more importantly, subcontracts went to this pool of folks. You now have you've pushed the contracting officers and the program offices to really think hard about who's going to win these competitions because they've got to meet the policy mandate. But you're also going to get the defense primes thinking a lot more about who are they going to partner with and start pulling that technology into the system. And this breaks that barrier where the appropriators are mandating where the money is exactly going, because this is a policy that HASC and SASC on the other side of the Congressional Defense Committee can kind of force. And now we'll see a proliferation of new non-traditional defense contractors, which the Atlantic Council talked a lot about, but didn't maybe make this type of recommendation to be able to think through, like, how do we really accelerate and adopt change? As for the DIU hedge portfolio, I think that falls more into that revolving door bucket, right, where they're going to be given a funding line. And we can talk, I think, a little bit later about how they can ensure some guardrails that they don't become a self-fulfilling ice cream cone, or self-licking ice cream cone in that respect. You know, Office of Strategic Capital, huge fan of what the department is doing, and Jason Rathje. But that's, I think, tackling a much larger, more macro problem around how do we put different types of funding to work, leveraging authorities that other agencies have to be able to shore up the defense industry base, not necessarily tied to direct funding to specific companies. And then what was that third piece of it? It was APFIT. Yeah, I think APFIT, it's starting to address a little bit of this bridge, you know, to get across the valley of death. I don't, you know, personally think it's maybe being executed as judiciously as maybe it ought to be, with when you look at how the process is being worked. But I think it's a start in the right direction. I think Rep. Calvert's intent is definitely in line with the types of innovative thinking we need to able to harness and bring compelling technology to the forefront.
Zach, speaking from industry perspective, you know, running into these kinds of issues on a daily basis with you know, navigating these different procurement contracts that exist, what do you think the impact would be to a company like Anduril if Pentagon did a better job of doing this?
Be $6 billion? Would you be like $60 billion?
Yeah. Well, I don't put this just on the building. I don't put this just on the services. It really is, to Cameron's earlier point about being more transparent against need and how we can characterize that need more effectively for commercial companies to address. I think for privately capitalized companies, it's transparent about how we think about product and where we're building product. So how can we give each of the service acquisition executives a better shadow of the future to understand where we're investing our capital, how we've structured that capital investment against a suite of products that are tackling a mission-oriented problem. We're not tackling a big R requirement, we're actually tackling a mission need. So how do you marry up the balance of operational end user need validation to an acquisition strategy that is laying in the right incentive structure to attract our continued investment in capital? And so this is the interesting valley that we find ourselves in right now, where like just reflecting back on the joys of sequestration back in the early 2010s, and what, you know, the harm that frankly that we did to ourselves within the building, and then, you know, in conjunction with Congress to delay hard decisions. Ultimately, this is about trade-offs, and this is about leaders making decisions that actually trade, to David's point, capability that we might otherwise being invested in today to that is proving most effective. And in order to persuade folks that you are either making the right decision or that you are willing and open to being held accountable such that you've made the wrong decision, being more transparent about that trade-off structure, that incentive structure, is going to be critical to us putting our capital to work in the best way, to our investors believing that their return on invested capital has a horizon and a multiple that's going to enable them to put more cash in our business and enable us to put more cash into commercial product. And I think that, you know, from a product focus, I think that's where there's more work to be done for the department to understand how a product-centric business builds capability in ways that are different and incentivized differently than program or contract-oriented businesses, where you're not focused on a consumable per se, you're focused on delivering a more generalized product that meets needs across a range of end users. You know, that business model requires the department, again, not with any new authorities, to engage and understand what incents the develop of that product differently at a different speed. How do I acquire that and sustain it in different ways? So the scaffolding exists. We just have to make it more mature, a bit more durable, such that others that are, especially commercial dual-use companies, can balance the trade-offs between the dualities of their business, where a long sales cycle, an uncertain future in the federal market makes it much harder to continue to justify that capital investment in the federal side of their business. And they will be pulled by closer speed to market, more customer intimacy, and shorter rate of return, quicker rate of return on their invested capital in their respective commercial markets. We have to recognize that about the business. And I think that's where the recently released National Defense Industrial Strategy does recognize some elements of these problems. It diagnoses our ailments well. Now we all have to align on what are we doing to address it. Long-winded answer to your more basic question of like, yeah, we'd be better off. But we want to be helpful in being part of that solution. There's a lot of us, that have experience in the department that are now out in industry that want to help as best as we can to align capability delivery against threats that our U.S. forces and allied and partner forces are facing. That's the motivating factor. How we take advantage of our incentive structure and our capital allocation should be considered a lever for the department. And how do we best help them pull that lever more effectively?
Pete, both the interim report from the Commission on Defense Innovation Adoption and the Defense Innovation Board's Strategic Investment Capital Task Force have advocated for consolidating various DoD budget accounts, also known in acquisition speak as program elements, into portfolios to bring, 1, greater flexibility, 2, align various services around creating mission impact instead of servicing a particular platform, and 3, foster greater participation from industry, including small businesses. Can you shed a little more light on this issue and give an example of a particular capability that's currently maybe stovepiped across a few PEOs that would benefit from this portfolio approach?
Sure, yeah, and this, starts to unpack the broader PPBE, reform that is desperately needed. And we've all advocated for some pretty bold reforms to various commissions, including the PPBE commission, that's coming out with their report next month. And we need to continue to push. There's some resistance in the system. And we saw the PE consolidation as one stepping stone to enable some of the greater speed and flexibility required in the system. When we talk about, right now the current environment is across the RDT&E and procurement accounts, there are 1,700 different program elements. So, the department, puts in a request and Congress appropriates, down to, pretty finite details of how you're going to manage each program, each capability. And a program element doesn't even equate equally to a program. Some programs are funded out of a dozen program elements, so it's a messy environment. But one of the things, when we studied the issue is, of those 1,700 accounts, nearly 40% of them are under $20 million. So fully appreciate Congress's oversight authority. When we're talking an $850 billion budget to get into $10 and $20 million accounts, and then if you want to move any money, if you didn't accurately predict 2 to 3 years out how to properly allocate all that funding, and you want to move funding around, it is a very laborious process that you have to go through many months through the departments and then go get approval from all 4 congressional committees. So by consolidating some of those program elements, it's still staying within the broader capability areas, whether it's within a PEO portfolio or some other mix, but to say take the like program elements, whether you're merging some smaller ones, merging small ones with some larger ones. But again, Congress is authorizing and appropriating to validate, yes, you have a need for that broader capability area. As things emerge, as new tech emerges, as the threats emerge, your strategy may change. That you may now be able to acquire something as a service, going through different appropriation issues. But there's nuances. There may be programs that are slipping. There may be higher priority issues. There may be new environments to tackle. So it's empowering portfolio managers to allocate resources to maximize that mission impact. So it's going to enable more companies to compete. Again, it's part of that broader portfolio environment of breaking down the program stovepipes to more that integrated suite of capabilities. So you allow the best and brightest ideas to prosper whether it's within the department or from industry solutions, again, to move out for that capability area. And when you look at where's the opportunity to start, it's anywhere where there's smaller, many high quantities of systems. So don't start with the aircraft carriers, nuke subs, and others. But, we see with Air Force with software factories, when you have enabling infrastructure that's supporting multiple programs, and then they get starved or it gets, piecemealed up across separate accounts. Whether it's counter UAS, ISR programs, there's an enduring capability need for these areas. But to properly predict 2 to 3 years out on 1,700 different accounts is ridiculous. So some consolidation, and again, it's a negotiation between the department and Congress on where it makes sense.
Just briefly on that, Pete, to follow up, one of the ways in which at an executive level we try to tackle this with Ash and Bob was to focus executive committee engagement on these mission areas that truly did cut across so many program elements, and in many cases cut across so many program executive authorities. Mm-hmm. How do you align these things effectively? One way in which, as an industry partner, we're now thinking about solving these problems, and let's use counter UAS as an example. So we partnered with U.S. Special Operations Command to provide counter UAS as a service. Recognizing that, from when I left the department back in 2016, that threat has meaningfully evolved and is continuing to evolve at a rate and a pace and in a manner and at a volume that we cannot plan our way into. We need a contract structure, a competitive capability development environment that enables SOCOM to evaluate, test, and then integrate that capability, which is proving itself in any part of the value chain in solving the counter UAS mission, whether that's detect, track, and ID, whether that's passive defeat and capture, whether that is kinetic intercept. And that change in the nature of that architecture is going to be very different from detecting and tracking and then ultimately defeating DJI, other Group 1s and Group 2s, to now detecting, defeating essentially low-flying cruise missiles. How do you enable the architecture and then a competitive environment for industry to understand, how do I best understand the problem today? How do I understand the contract mechanisms that enable me to deliver and then have my capability evaluated, and such that I prove to be more operationally effective at solving this threat now, I have a pathway in to some meaningful volume of sale that I know I can then invest back into further capability development to continue to improve that, because I don't want to lose that opportunity. I want to make sure that my passive detect is the best passive RF detect that's out there. How do we think about competition in an environment that inherently involves many aspects that are anti-competitive, because we have, depending on your service, depending on your program, monopsony-like characteristics. For those programs and those mission threats, especially where you're trying to derive capability that's commercially developed, how do you think about breed competition and take advantage of that in different ways? I think these types of missions actually enable you to think about the contract structure, incentive alignment, in ways that are not capture laden with the aspects of PPB that we all recognize are a challenge to confront and ultimately not well suited to fielding capability of speed and relevance across these mission areas.
Yeah, so that ties perfectly into the portfolio management approach. The combatant commanders are screaming about the UAS threat. Dr. LaPlanta at Reagan National talked about we need production at scale for counter UAS solutions like we did 155s. So it's capturing that broader requirement set. We have the JCO, Joint Counter UAS Office, that's supposed to look across the services, but capture the broader requirements set, Group 1s and 2s, 3s and beyond, and then what each of the services and agencies are doing, and then from a program aspect, from an acquisition strategy and a contract strategy, weave it all through.
David, real quick, the main critique I've heard from Congressman Calvert's hedge portfolio proposal for DIU is that it would result in them transitioning technology in this parallel acquisition system that would allow PEOs to tell people receiving OTs from DIU, hey, you have your own budget, leave us alone. Do you think that that's a valid concern, and what could be done to prevent that?
All right, so the fear is if DIU gets its own funding, then they don't need to create transition partners for the follow-on production contracts. And with the hedge funding, which is, it was proposed to be $1 billion, we'll see where it ends up shaking out in the appropriations bill. I think the reality is that that's not nearly enough money to be able to like provide the long tail for the types of projects that DIU has undertaken. So, I think I look at it as like 3 steps. There's the validate step, the accelerate step, and then the codify step. Today, we're already doing the validate. So they're getting requirements, whether they're JSIDs approved or JUONs, UONs, GEONs, just commander letters of intent. They're figuring out a way to go ahead and do these prototype projects with small dollars to just validate that this thing works. The hedge fund operates as the accelerant towards, let's go from prototype to, let's call it LRIP if we're staying within the acquisition framework. Let's get it out to the users. Let's see it operationalized in small contingents. But there's still that long tail of like going full on, or full rate production. And I think in order to apply money to the accelerate, step 3 or stage 3 of codify is you need to make sure that the combatant commanders have put that requirement high on their priority list through the integrated priority list, which is how they tell the services what's important to them. And then you go back to the services and you say, before I put this money in, you're working the POM right now for 2 years in advance. Are you going to highlight which program element this accelerant of hedge funding is going into so that Congress and the American people can trace back exactly what you're doing with that hedge fund and how it's leading towards faster adoption into the areas that are very important and already codified within the justification books. So this is all procedural. I think it can be done. We already have a framework for it. This is just, again, like a way to ensure that DIU does not become sort of self-fulfilling, that they are engaged and entrenched with the larger system, but getting the needs of the combatant commanders solved much faster at the speed of relevancy versus the speed of bureaucracy. So,
General Holt, from all your experience, all the time you spent in government and now in industry, if you became Undersecretary of Defense and Acquisition and Sustainment tomorrow and had to make 3 changes to the way that Pentagon buys capabilities, what changes would you make and why?
Yeah, and I have 2 minutes to tell the audience about that. No, it's a great question. I would work transparently with the Congress, with the defense industry, and with the department to do 2 primary things. One is immediately put us on a wartime footing. Stop talking about it, let's do it. And one of the things that means is removing all the barriers to entry. Every single regulation, DoD 5000, the financial management regulation, all of those provisions in there would have to defend itself against my cut. I did this in the Air Force. We called it Operation Clean Sweep. In the first year of my change initiative, we deleted every single mandatory procedure in Air Force contracting and every PGI reference because people were trying to hide the mandatory procedures in the PGI. We deleted over 700 pages of mandatory guidance, and it freed up an enormous amount of innovative thinking. I don't think we can rely on just what I call the cool kid organizations, the rapid acquisition cells, the DIU, the haves versus the have-nots. And I'll tell you the truth, with the right rule set and leadership, I can grab at random 100 people across the department acquisition program will stand up a rapid acquisition cell. The other side of putting us on a wartime footing immediately is standing up a DPA Title III line that actually gets after it. Not SBIR's money, not $1 billion, but actually goes after this in a way that doesn't compete with the Department of Defense budget. So think about like a OCO budget, but now it's separate from the Department of Defense, and it is for the purpose of warfighting, a very sophisticated economic and supply chain war that I would get after in a very robust way. And then on the other side, I would change the acquisition system, the enduring acquisition system, from a capabilities-based acquisition system to a threat-based acquisition system. And so maybe you'll have to invite me back more later, and we'll talk about what exactly that looks like.
Well, that sounds like a plan. Thank you all so much for joining. This has been a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate you all's time. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and the next session will begin in a few minutes.